Hi, and welcome to my FlossTube channel. I'm Jean Farish, and I am glad that we get to spend this time together. I have had 3 of my samplers on my mind, it seems, for the last 6 months, and very intensely for the last week. First of all, Roxy has been absorbing most of my stitching time, and of course, I'm stitching a month ahead of everybody else. So while the Stitch Along participants are working on part 3, I've been focusing on getting myself ready for part 4, and I will start stitching that probably tomorrow. So today's the last day I get to really show you Roxy, because I do try to keep it under wraps until the people who are participating get a chance to see what's in store for them next. But the 2 antique reproductions, Janet and Jane, have both really been on my mind. And I will start with talking a little bit about Jane Hattersley. This is not brand new news, but the first time I've really talked about it here on FlossTube. One of the Stitch Along participants, a wonderful stitcher by the name of Shirley, spent her own time and used her incredible research talents to learn a little bit about Jane Hattersley. And she very quickly latched on to the fact that there were crowns in her sampler, in Jane's sampler. And so that led Shirley to think, well, maybe she actually was born in England. So she started with English records and found a couple of young girls by the name of Jane Hattersley who would have been living about the same time that the sampler was dated. So what she did, though, was she was able to narrow it down to which Jane it was by identifying her siblings who matched the initials on Jane's sampler. So let's take a look at that. So when we look at this row of letters right below the alphabet, the SH is apparently her father, Solomon Hattersley. The JH, her mother, who was also named Jane. And then her sister, Sarah. She had another sister, Mary Ann. A brother named Solomon. And a sister named Charlotte. Now, the other sets of initials here, the WH, and way over here, the EA, she was not able to find a match for them. But this is pretty good evidence that my Jane is the same Jane that she found these records for. It's not uncommon to find baptism records and not what we would think of as being a birth certificate, given the time and the culture of the place. So she was able to find the baptism record for Jane, and she was born in Yorkshire, England, in 1822. So that tells us the date that's on Jane's sampler, 1832, is obviously not her birth date, which then leads me to think that April 9th, the rest of the date that's on her sampler, is not her birthday. So, and she does have on here that she was 10 years old when she stitched the sampler. So that's further proof that the 1832 date on the sampler and the fact that she said she's 10 matches this baptism record that Shirley found. And Shirley found baptism records for Jane's sisters, Mary Ann and Charlotte. And so that just, even though she didn't find matches for all the sets of initials, that is certainly an ample amount of evidence that this is our Jane. So I wanted to share that with you today. The Janet Irving sampler was on my mind this week when I was asked a question about how Janet spelled the word Harkness on her sampler. Now, I still can't identify why she stitched E and M Harkness on her sampler in such a predominant spot. It's in red and right there under the house. But I can answer the question as to why it appears to be Harkness rather than a double S on the end. First of all, that's not an F. It is definitely an S, and it's known as a medial or long S. And that isn't, it's not a matter of pronunciation. It's a matter of where the letter appears in the word in terms of its location within the word. So until the late 1800s, it was a very common way to write the letter S. Basically, there were two styles of lowercase s's. The one that we are familiar with, that is referred to as a short or round S, and this one that's long and swoopy, that's referred to as a medial or long S. So when Janet stitched her sampler, that would have been the common way to write the letters. Again, it's not a spelling thing. It's the way you actually form the letters and the use of them within the way the word is spelled. So some of what I'm going to tell you, I learned in my research days way back in college. I was a history major, and in reading original documents, either hand-lettered or early printed editions of broadsheets and speeches and whatnot, it was very common to come across this. So one of the things I learned is way back, like 10th, 11th century or whatever, that what we think of as the letter S was only used as a capital letter, and the swoopy S was used as the lowercase letter. So then around the 15th century, the rules were changed yet again. And if a word was not to be capitalized, then that swoopy S was used at the beginning of the word and anywhere it appeared in the middle of the word, but never at the end of the word. At the end of the word, there was always what we think of as that round or short letter S. So there were a whole lot more complicated rules than just those, but those are the ones that apply to what we're talking about today with Janet's sampler. By the way, we Americans are really pretty familiar with this configuration. When you look at a copy of the Bill of Rights, for example, the first S in Congress is the long swoopy medial S, and the last S in Congress is the one that we're familiar with. So why don't we have these two forms of the letter S today? Well, you can actually thank the invention of the printing press. And as it became more and more commonly used in the way the printers kept their letters, which, by the way, that's where we get the terms uppercase and lowercase, was when they had their sets of letters, they were actually in two separate cases. So in the lowercase case, after a while, having to keep two sets of the letter S's became just cumbersome. And so after a while, that long S was dropped, and we have the form of the letter S that we use today. So again, when you look at the Janet Irving sampler and many other old samplers, if you see that elongated S, the schoolgirl has not made a mistake. She is not stitching the letter F. She is using the proper use of the letter S that is relative to the time in which she lived. So all this talk of research has led me to think about another research project that I've been working on actually for a couple of years now, and that's to get a definitive answer to the question, what is embroidery? And I have seen a wide range of answers. I always check my sources, and I want to rely on a legitimate source, and that they are the only ones I'm ever going to share with you. And so one of the answers that I found on the V&A Museum website. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London has an incredible textile department, and they certainly are a legitimate source. There's no doubt about that. So I will share that link in the episode notes so that you can click on it and go directly there and see, straight from them what they had to say about needlework. And although I liked their answer, I felt like it really wasn't complete enough. I really think it would take a book to answer that question, what is embroidery? So this, I'll share with you what I've been thinking about so far. First of all, to me, the word embroidery and needlework are interchangeable. They are synonyms. And they have to do with working with a needle that has an eye that can be threaded, as opposed to, say, a knitting needle or other types of needles. So to me, that's the first clarifier. And then after that, it's like, how do you categorize this information? And I think that one of the big ones is the ground cloth that we use. So that's where, for example, I would separate needlepoint, which is done on canvas, and a whole bunch of other types of embroidery that are done on fabric. And then when you look at the fabric side of that, actually, I don't want to ignore that needlepoint that I just put over here. Like, if we took a look at needlepoint, then we would look at things underneath that. So let's set that aside for a moment and talk about the types of embroidery and needlework that are done on cloth. So then what I would do is take that cloth idea and separate it into two categories. One is the fabric that is woven so finely that you barely even see the threads. So think of muslin and silk and fine cottons, what you might embroider, say, on a handkerchief. Those types of fabrics I would separate from what we do over here that are for counted thread. So if the fabric, and when I say coarse, obviously if you're stitching on 45 count linen, that's not a coarse fabric. But compared to what I just put over here, the silks and the fine cottons and whatnot, then it is a lot more coarse. So over here, and I don't want to say that they're not even weaves, because again, oh, don't get me started on the modern uses of the word even weave, which we are separate. People just totally separate from meaning linen or any other types of fabrics that are evenly woven. Anyway, let's use the word plain weave. I think that maybe is more clear. So you've got this category of fabrics that are very, very tightly, finely woven in a plain weave. As I said, the silks, the really fine cottons that are used for much of hand embroidery. And then over here, you have a coarser plain weave. And in that category, those are the fabrics that you can do counted thread work on. So in that category over here of the fine fabrics, much of what is done there is referred to as surface embroidery, and there's a whole lot of handwork types of embroidery under that category. And those alone are worth a lot of time and attention. But because I know my audience, I know it's stuff over here, this counted thread stuff is really what we are the most familiar with. So that is one way to try to define what is embroidery. Is you've got the ground cloth, is it canvas, is it fabric, and then when you look at the fabric, is it this really fine, like you can barely even see the threads type fabric, or the coarser fabrics that we are used to, where we actually can see the linen threads and count them. And then under that category, now we're just talking about this one segment of fabric that is useful for doing counted thread. And then under that category, then you've got a question of what are you doing with the fabric? Are you just making stitches over it, like the X's that we do? Are you making stitches that you're pulling in such a way that you're rearranging those linen threads? Are you actually taking some of the linen threads out entirely? Are you cutting some of them away? These are all ways that we can categorize different types of embroidery. So there's other ways that that embroidery can be categorized also, including what types of threads that are used. Are you stitching with silk ribbon? Are you stitching with sashiko threads? Are you stitching with, I think of a Brazilian embroidery, for example, uses a whole different type of thread than what I am accustomed to stitching with in the type of embroidery that I've been doing for 40 years. And then there's the whole category of things like crazy quilts and applique that start pulling in quilting with embroidery. And it's easy to see why people are confused and why this question, exactly what is embroidery, has so many different answers. One further thing to throw in there are cultural, not necessarily cultural different, well, I guess they are cultural differences, but types of embroidery that we identify with certain types of cultures that have developed them and are known for them, like Sashiko embroidery. So at any rate, I'm not ready to write a book on this, and if anybody has a suggestion of a book that they feel like truly answers that question, what is embroidery, please leave me a comment or send me an email and let me know, because I would really like to do, well, when I started to say I'd like to do more research, I think that this has been a lifelong passion for me, and I will continue doing research and trying to get an answer to that question. And when I get answers, I am going to be happy to share them with you. I've been working on my Gracious Words sampler a lot this week, getting prepared for the middle part of this. So far, it's all been cross stitch, and I showed you a bit of this. I guess last week, was it? Anyway, stitching with this wonderful range of greens and reds. I did this border across the top. And by the way, this is from an antique sampler that I actually got from the V&A Museum. I didn't get the sampler from the V&A Museum, but many, many years ago, man, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago, I was able to spend some time studying the samplers at the V&A Museum. They have totally changed the way they handle this now, but back then you could actually go into a study room and they had catalogs that you would look through, and you would ask, request a certain sampler, and they would actually bring the sampler to you, and I could sit there with my colored pencils and graph paper and chart these motifs out. You can't do that now, but you could at that time, and so that's where this sampler border comes from. And so in this sampler, my next thing is going to be to do a little bit of pulled thread work, and it's not going to be pulled as tightly as I normally do because it's a much denser fabric. But what I wanted to show you is this wonderful Valdani over-dyed pearl cottons that I got, and I, like you, I mean, I couldn't go into the store to choose them, so I ordered a whole bunch of different colors, and I'll figure out which one I think is going to look best on this. But that's going to be my next thing to do, and then I'm going to do some raised embroidery, also known as stump work, on this piece as well. So this is one of the things I have going on. I'm really excited about this piece. It's sort of stump work or raised embroidery is more of a challenge of any other type of embroidery I've ever done. Cross stitch is so simple that I can use, again, colored pencils on graph paper is the way I originally did all my designing, and nowadays with software. But raised embroidery, the only way you can design it is just to do it. And so that's going to be kind of a not new experience for me, but one that will certainly apply to this project. So don't expect to see much in the way of the progress that I'm making on this, maybe until I'm done with it. Not really keen to show you my failures, I guess is what it really comes down to. So until I actually work out exactly how I want to do it and how I'm going to teach it, then you probably aren't going to see it again. So that's Gracious Words. Actually, before I leave this topic, there's one more thing I do want to say. I found that as I was stitching this, I had to do a little bit of gridding. I mean, I know you know that I very often do basting, but I had to do some serious gridding. Not the whole piece, just that corner. Now, part of this is because I was binge watching Private Practice. When was that out? 80s, 90s? I don't even remember, but I came across it and went all the way back to season 1, episode 1, and I've been watching it, which is kind of a crazy thing to do. Anyway, I found that as I was stitching this part, which is certainly more intense and had more color changes than many parts of the types of samplers that I usually design, that I kept making mistakes. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to do what I'm going to coin the phrase a mini grid. And that is to actually grid that section so that I can stitch without errors. So I had to make the video before today so that I could actually show it to you in progress. So that's what I'm going to edit in right now. I've mentioned before that I very often baste and very rarely grid my fabric. But when I'm working something with a lot of color changes, that's dense stitching like this, I do find myself putting in a grid just in the area where I need it. I certainly would not do it for this entire project, but as I was stitching this row of roses and rosebuds, and at the same time binge watching Private Practice, I found that I needed that extra little help. And in this case, I have simply used scraps of my floss, and I am stitching over 2 and under 2, over 2 and under 2, since I'm doing my cross stitches over 2. So this is an example where I do sort of a complete grid, but only in the area where I'm going to need it. I certainly would not need it down here with the letters. And like, I didn't even do the 10th row down here because I knew that none of the buds were going to come down and cross where the line of alphabet letters is. Yeah, so don't hesitate to do more than basting. And one of the things that I want to make between basting and a grid, when you are creating a grid on your fabric, you want those lines to match the dark lines on your chart. They have nothing to do with the motifs themselves. They are there as a way to use a reference to associate the grid lines in your pattern with the grid lines that you're creating on your fabric. So that's a difference to me between basting is when I am going to stitch a line because I want things to line up with that line. A grid matches every 10th line that's darker on your chart. And the last thing I want to talk to you about today is really one of the basics of cross stitch, and that's stripping floss. And that question popped up in a couple different places this week. Maybe it's always been there and I just didn't notice it, but somehow I kept coming across that question this week. So I thought, well, you know what? Maybe we need to talk about it here. So exactly what is stripping? How do you do it? And why do you do it? I'll start with the why. So we strip our floss so that we can get consistent coverage and get the best coverage. How you do it is to cut a length of your floss. I'm just going to pull out a relatively short piece of floss here. Doesn't really matter how long that floss is. And what you want to do is tap the end of it until you can see the individual strands. Most floss is a 6-strand thread. There are some that are 4, but this is a 6. And after I've separated them, I can take any one and start pulling it out. And as I do, you can see that the remainder just starts getting kind of bunched up here, but that's not knotted up. Okay, I'm just going to lay this out here, but and this just gets released. So if I were stitching with 2 strands, if I needed 2 strands, I would then take a second piece out and do the same thing. And then these are the 2 that I could stitch with. Now, I also want to be clear, these are strands of floss. Apply is a whole different term. So that is stripping your floss. Even if I'm going to stitch with all 6 strands, I would still strip the floss before I started stitching. So whether you're stitching with 2 strands or 3, 4, 6, whatever, you want to strip your floss first, because when it comes right off the skein, it's pretty tightly compacted in. And if you start stitching with it right off the skein, if, for example, you needed to stitch with all 6 strands, then by the time you got to the middle of that strand, they're going to start separating themselves, and so your coverage is going to be different. So that's one of the reasons why you want to strip your floss. Most cross stitchers do it because rarely do we stitch with more than 2 strands. There certainly is a whole school of thought of people who like to stitch with 3 strands, and they tell me they do that because they get good coverage. And I have to wonder whether or not their coverage wouldn't be improved if they just made sure that they stripped their floss and that the 2 floss strands were always parallel to each other, and not lying on top of each other and not twisted. But that's a whole nother topic, which I have talked about before here, and I'm sure I'll talk about it again. But at any rate, that's what stripping floss is, and most of us have been doing it and may not have even known that that's what we called it. I feel like I've been all over the place today with topics and opinions and tips and research and whatnot, but I've had a good time, and I hope that you have too. And meanwhile, I'm looking at a sign right here that says subscribe as a reminder for me to ask you to subscribe to my channel, so I hope that you do. But more than that, what I hope is that for the coming week that you stay safe and stitch happy. I'll see you next week.